So welcome everybody to the Haven podcast. This is the first episode that we're doing. We're really excited about it. I'm here with my brother Ezra. He's going to give me a cut while we're going.
Let's go.
And today we're just going to kind of kick it off and kind of just set the stage for what we're hoping can happen through this podcast and what God can do. We're calling it the Haven for a couple different reasons. And one of the reasons is Haven really is talk about safety and refuge, a place of refuge. And what we're wanting, first of all, is that this is going to be a place where people can feel safe, bringing up difficult questions, bringing up their doubts and things that they may have in relationship to God and who He is or how they're supposed to interact with Him. Also, we want it to be a place where people can ask questions that in other places people may say are like dumb questions or things that like you shouldn't ask. We really just want it to be a spot where people can ask any sort of question and we can have all kinds of different conversation. And one of the other things is we really just, through the conversation that we have, want to be able to show people that God is our refuge and the reason why we can trust Him for our safety. A lot of times people can just really get into the mindset of trying to protect themselves and save themselves. And so through this podcast, we just really want it to be a place where people can really just start to trust God and start to relinquish control and find safety in Him.
Amen.
So the first thing that we're going to jump into today is going through what the good news of Jesus is. This is something that sometimes we can throw around and talk about a lot, but we want to make sure that we really give some extra context to it so that people really know what we're talking about when we talk about the gospel and when we're talking about the good news of Jesus. But we're going to start all the way at the beginning of the Bible, in the very first book of the Bible, which is called Genesis. And in this book, it starts out with the creation story. So let's talk about how the world was created. And it talks about all of the different things that God created. He created light, and He created the animals and the trees, and started to lay all these things into foundation. But that at the end of their creation, He was creating humans. And at this point, we start to see that there was something set apart about His relationship with the human race.
We see first God saying, let's create man in our image. I think I love when God refers to Himself as our, because I know there's always a lot of confusion of like, how is God like one, but He's like three and all this stuff. And that sounds like a whole nother podcast right there, a whole other episode right there. But we see God desiring to be, I mean, really, for lack of better words, friends. Says that God would take strolls in the garden with Adam and Eve, and they described them as friends. There was an intimacy that they had there, and all these beautiful things that God had created, like light, stars, and moons, and the planet, and animals, and all these things. It was almost like God just made this crazy hangout spot for Him and us. You know what I'm saying? And it seems to be like amongst all these things that God had created, the only thing that He said that's created in our image is mankind. Everything else was like, oh, this was cool, I'm going to create light, and this is cool, I'm going to create night and day and all these things. But like it gets real serious because God, it's the only time that God created something without just using His word. But He says that He formed us out of the dust and breathed life into us. That's pretty intimate. You know what I'm saying? And that's like that really sets us apart from the rest of God's creation.
For sure. We also see in that one of the main reasons for God creating everything was to bring glory to Himself. And 100%. When we use the word glory, we're talking about just basically magnifying something and showing how great it is. So God was creating all of these things to show how great He is, and one of the main ways that He wanted to show that was through the human race. And originally that's what we were created and intended to do, and that's what we were able to do perfectly. So at the beginning, we were able to just really perfectly be in right relationship with God and glorify Him with the way that we lived. And really the only thing that God asked, He gave us this garden that was beautiful, that had all kinds of different fruit and things that we were able to enjoy. But that at one point He says but there's one tree that I don't think you should eat from. That I'm saying you could have access to all these other things, but I'm just asking that you would not eat from this one tree. And we were actually talking yesterday about how like God could have just set that into place and just let us figure it out instead of like, hey, like, I'm not going to say what to do or what not to do. Like, you just make your own decisions and just kind of see what comes of it. But that he was very clear in his direction and said, this tree you should not eat from. But obviously then we chose on our own to eat from that tree.
I think it's something that always comes up, at least in conversations that I have with maybe people who are new to who God is or just history in general. They always go, why did God put that tree in there if he knew it was going to mess everything up? And I think that points to the humility of who God is and that he really desires a willing relationship with us. An all-powerful God who created these beings who literally can't breathe without him. And he's going, okay, I'm going to give you the option to choose something besides me. That's crazy to me. Right. If I was God, boy, you got no other choice but to follow me. Like that, I'm thankful I'm not him because I'm not humble enough, you know what I'm saying, to be who he is and to still give us an option to choose something else.
Right.
But man, as we all know, and if you haven't found out yet, you will soon, we are all selfish and we all think that we're capable of living life on our own, living life with our own power, our own understanding. And that's exactly what Adam and Eve went and did. They saw the fruit. They said, wow, it looks amazing. Why wouldn't I try to eat that? I think I can do just fine on my own. And they ate from it.
Yeah. And the other thing we see in that spot is that as Satan comes in to deceive them and he starts to try to trick them into eating this fruit, he starts to question what God actually said. And the way that Eve remembers it is different than what God actually said. And so what we start to see is that sin and choosing something against God in itself is not always just like a really terrible thing to do. So like, it obviously wasn't just like the end of the world that they were going to like eat a piece of fruit. But because God said for them not to, that was what made it something that was against God's will. But what Satan tries to do is he tries to come in and deceive us, tries to make us think that, well, if you really think about it, it's really not that big of a deal, and tries to make it into the action more than just going against God's will.
That's good.
So after this, after we ate the fruit, there was what a lot of people call the fall, which is the perfect relationship that we had with God was broken because we chose to go against what he was saying. And automatically at that moment, we started to try to take glory for ourselves instead of the way that we were intended to give glory to God. And whenever this was broken, we now weren't able to have right relationship with God, but he still wanted to be able to find a way to be in relationship with us. And one of the things that God put into place early on was a sacrificial system in order for us to be back into right relationship with him. We see in some of the books right after the book of Genesis some of the ways that we were trying to be made right with God, and a lot of times it was really kind of bloody and gory. It was a lot of sacrifices of animals and a lot of different blood rituals that were needed in order to cleanse us. And that whenever we would choose to do something wrong or we would choose sin.
Switch the mic to the other side.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Whenever we would choose something wrong, we would choose sin, we would have to go in and make a sacrifice in order to be made right with God.
Again, with the intensity of all that, and I think what was really important about what you said about like Satan trying to make things about the action instead of the heart behind it, God does the exact opposite. He's trying to get at our heart and not just these actions. And the point of this sacrificial system was to show, look, this is what is required. This is the debt that's required to be paid so that you and me, being God, can be in a relationship. Like that's when they would see those animals getting sacrificed in their place, they're going, wow, that's how badly I've sinned against you, is that someone deserves that punishment to pay for that price that that debt that I've racked up against you, God. And so that's supposed to do something in our hearts. And that's what God was really getting at. Not just like, oh, go kill an ox and then you're good. You know what I'm saying? Again, that imagery is super intense. But instead of shying away from the fact of like, wow, God, why would you do something so intense? Really what we should be going is going, whoa, that just goes to show how great you are. That we have to use an imagery so intense just to barely capture like the graveness and the seriousness of the situation.
Yeah, and like what we were talking about earlier, like there's obviously a lot of deception in things when it comes to sin. And one of the ways that we've become deceived is we've become numb to how intense our sin is against God. And what I heard someone say recently is they said, if I lie, I at that point have sinned against an eternal God, which automatically deserves eternal punishment, just off of one wrong thing that I do. So then what we're seeing in that sacrificial system is this is a really like permanent debt that is being put onto maybe an animal or something. And it was supposed to be a representation of the fact that we are sinning against an eternal God, and that it did deserve eternal punishment, but that he was getting us a way out of that.
That's good.
And another part of that was that God put that into place in order for us to be able to be in right relationship with him. But then we started to twist even that sacrificial system. And we started to think that, okay, I basically can kind of just go and do whatever I want. And as long as I go and like kill a lamb at the end of the day or whatever, but then I'm good. And we started to use and manipulate the sacrificial system in order to try to still do what we could, kind of do what we want.
Yeah, that's where we go back to the father of lies, Satan, twisting things and taking things back to the action instead of the heart. Because he knows if our heart isn't being changed, and nothing's happening. I don't care what you do, if your heart ain't changing, it just took all the power out of it. And that's again part of us. I mean, back in the garden, that's us trying to take control again. It's okay, I can do what I want. If I just do these few things, I'm back in control. I can do what I want, and then, oh, okay, God, forgive me, I killed this lamb. But we're still in control if we live that way.
Right.
But we see what happened when we got our first taste of control in the garden. Immediately, what happened was we were separated from God, and now sin and death entered into the world, which is something that was never meant to be a part of God's creation. So it's like, yeah, like God gave us the option if we want to have control, or this false sense of control that we think we have in our lives, but we see the fruit of that whenever we live it out is it leads to death.
Yeah, for sure. Well, and even another part of that, of why we have constantly been making these decisions, is that originally in the garden before the fall, there was what the Bible calls a healthy fear of the Lord, which doesn't just mean that we're like scared of God or like worried about what he's going to do, but that we have a reverence for God, and that we realize how holy he is, how set apart he is, how in control he is, and how loving he is. So before the fall, we had a reverential fear of God. But then when we chose sin, we were saying that we actually feared ourselves more than we feared God. That we started to put ourselves in God's place.
That's a good way to put it.
And the same thing happened in the sacrificial system. That sacrificial system was supposed to bring us back to a healthy fear of God and put God back in his proper place. But then as we started to manipulate it and turn it into what would benefit us, we again started to fear ourselves and maybe even the people around us more than we feared God. So when we were in this spot, through this whole time, God has been chasing his people down and still trying to get back into right relationship with us. And that just really starts to show the type of love that he has for us, that he set it up perfectly. He had it just the way that it needed to be. We chose to break it, and he still just kept chasing after us and trying to give us new options. So when we were in this spot of just messing up and manipulating the sacrificial system, God started to put into a plan of a way to permanently save us, of a way to permanently bring us back into right relationship with Him. And so what He started to do is He started to send prophets. He started to send people who were able to tell basically the future of what God was going to do in the future, and start to talk about how God was going to be able to bring us back into right relationship. So,
as like a brief overview of all of them, it's crazy how like they're just constantly saying the same thing. I think that's like wild. Like over all these centuries of prophets being sent, the message does not change. You know what I'm saying? It keeps being, turn back to God. You know who I am. I'm going to have mercy on you if you come back to me. I'm going to restore you. I'm going to give you all of these things that I've always desired to give you, and have this relationship I've always desired to have with you. Like it never switches. And it keeps being, I'm going to pay for your debt. It's wild. And I think that's like that consistency, that integrity of God's character is seen throughout centuries of disobedience from His people. And God's still going like, yeah, like regardless of all of this, you can tell God's already made a commitment to us to make sure that we're saved from the things that have been separating us from Him. And He doesn't switch it up no matter what we do, no matter what they did back then, no matter what we're doing now. God's made a commitment to us, and He continues to show that through every era and every age of His prophets.
Yeah, that's good. I've read through a few of them recently, and another topic that I see a lot of times through it is that God was constantly referring and making references to His people as if they were His bride. And that He really is kind of talk about as they're going and choosing some of these other things, that it's like feeling like we're like having an affair on Him, or we're cheating on Him when we're running to all these other things, other created things to do what the Creator was supposed to do. And so you see that a lot through what the prophets were saying too, is, man, just God is trying to have just a one-on-one relationship with you. He originally was sustaining you, and you chose against it, like trying to really convince like how it was in the beginning was the way that you were created to function. And what sometimes we don't realize, like you in the book that we have, like you get to the end of the Old Testament and then you flip to the next page and the New Testament starts, but like in between those two books there was hundreds of years of silence, and that there were people who had heard these prophets talk about someone who was supposed to be coming, but there's just silence from God, and so they don't know when it's supposed to happen. And I'm sure a lot of people were probably thinking it wasn't going to happen. But as we start to see at the beginning of the Old Testament, in the accounts of Jesus' life, which obviously is who God was, obviously who God was talking about and predicting coming, we start to see this plan start to go into place. When you think about the birth of Jesus, what are maybe some things that have stuck out to you in the past that have been encouraging to you in that?
What comes immediately to my head is like the humility that Jesus came here in. I don't recall exactly which letter this was from Paul, but he talks about like Jesus didn't count it as robbery or think it was like unfair, or even like, well, wasn't like, oh, I have to like give up my position and come here and be with these people. Like came here in humility. I mean, you think about who Jesus is, like Alpha and Omega, never has not existed, always been around, perfect in holiness, power, understanding, and knowledge. And like, yo, that's a crazy position to give up to come be here with us, basically his cheating spouse.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? Like gave up the throne to come be here with us. That always gets me, and was willing to come here and be birthed into this world like one of us.
Right.
Lowly, dependent on his mother. I mean, he was a baby. Right. You know what I'm saying? Like, and it wasn't that he couldn't have did it without his mother, but he humbled himself so that to a point where like his mother had to help him and nurse him. Like, that doesn't make any sense to me that God humbled himself to a point that he needed human help.
Yeah.
Just so that like he could show like, I'm willing to get in the dirt with you. You know what I'm saying? He was willing to humble himself and lower himself to our position. That just like gets me every time.
For sure.
That's wild to me.
Yeah. That's definitely crazy to think about. And then like thinking about Jesus walking around on earth and like really like walking on the creation that he was a part of creating in the beginning.
Yeah, that's
like
wild.
that just is like hard to even wrap your mind around.
Literally, I can't. I definitely can't.
But one of the things I think that sometimes I've kind of glossed over in the past is that Jesus didn't start his actual ministry until he was 30. So really for the first 30 years of his life, which is a long time, like I think like I'm not even 30 yet, and I like feel like I've been here for a long time already. But like until he was 30, he was just working a regular job as a carpenter. I'm sure growing up around siblings and parents, just really just living a regular life and just like living and walking around with his creation. Which again is just like another just huge sign of humility. But then as he starts his ministry, he kind of comes onto the scene in an interesting way in some of the first gospel accounts. And he was at a wedding, and at this wedding they had run out of wine at the celebration at the end of the wedding. And Jesus' mother was there, and she walks up to him and says, Jesus, they ran out of wine. And Jesus' immediate response is that my time has not yet come. And that's always been kind of like confusing to me. Like, she's not talking about your time yet. She was just saying they ran out of wine. But really it starts to show that Jesus already knew what he was going to do at the end of his life. And that all of the things that he did from that moment on were all in perspective of what he knew he was going to do for us at the end of his life. So then that story ends with him turning water to wine, and that kind of being the first public miracle that he performed, where people started to see, oh, there's like something different about this.
I think something that really stands out to me, right moments leading up to a particular miracle that he had performed, was I can't remember exactly what it was that he had done. I want to say it was either healing somebody or casting out a demon. That was like his two favorites. But he like exclaimed, like excitedly, like exclaimed, like, this is a work set up for me through my Father so that I will be glorified. Like, it's like the things he was doing, it wasn't just to like, oh no, like, I'm so sad that like you can't see, like you're blind. Although that wasn't God's intention for his creation, of course he's going to be sad in that like his creation has fallen and it's suffering. But like ultimately his goal and his plan for healing us and for performing these miracles were so that we would know, whoa, you are the true living God. And glory and like that reverence for him would be restored through the healing of his people. So it wasn't just a thing of like, oh man, like God hates blindness. Which again, I know that wasn't God's intention for his creation, but ultimately we see God's heart and going like, man, like I'm trying to show you who I am. And so that we can restore this relationship, and so that I'm glorified again as God and you as my people. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And that changes the heart behind it. Because like, why have two eyes and see if you don't know the living God?
Right.
You know what I'm saying? Like, God don't want a bunch of able-bodied people going to hell.
Right.
He wasn't healing them so they could like walk through the gates. You know what I'm saying? Like, he's like, nah, like, I'm trying to heal you so you know who I am. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. Well, and as he's going and performing some of these miracles and stuff like that, there was a group that the Gospels refer to quite a bit called the Pharisees. And these were people who were experts in the law and in the old sacrificial system. So they were people who had studied and followed other teachers and really just like learned what it meant to be clean in the old sacrificial system. And so when Jesus came and started doing some of the stuff that he did, you started to see that they did not like a lot of the stuff he was doing because it didn't line up with the old sacrificial system.
Mm-hmm.
So then you start to see Jesus is a lot of times trying to convince these people that this way that he's doing it is going to be the new and more permanent way of doing it, and not having to lean on this old sacrificial system.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we're going to pause there for now. Thank you all so much for joining us for episode 1 of The Haven.
And make sure to tune in for episode 2, where we're going to wrap up this gospel presentation. Like he said, we're so glad to have you with us, and may God bless y'all.